So let's take a look at the functionality and practicality of using the Fred add-in tool for graphing economic data in either a time series or scatter plot function. So first of all, I have my Fred add-in downloaded already, and as you can tell from this particular menu, I'm going to go ahead and zoom in a little bit here just to be sure. View. There we go. I have my Fred add-in with different functional capabilities. The Get Fred Data is the button we'll use the most in terms of gathering that data. Now let's suppose I've asked you all to create a GDP gap. So in this sense, I'll be defining that as the difference between, say, real GDP, which is from the tag GDP C1, the growth rate of real GDP in a year-over-year sense, minus potential GDP. Now some people use a bit of a different definition of the output gap. I'm going to use just the difference between these growth rates of our potential GDP or our trend GDP and our real observed GDP. Both of these are inflation adjusted. Now, I want to use percent change from year ago, so I will use, and I'll probably have some written directions for you guys on this, how to do this, but just to show you the functionality, I want the observations to be an annual. So any data manipulations are going to go in the second row, the tags go in the first row, changes to levels or conversions into growth rates will go in the second row. Observation time period, or sorry, not time period, observations in units will be, say, annual. Since this is GDP, I could change that to quarterly. If this were had monthly or daily data, I could use that, but GDP is, of course, not collected in monthly. All right, so let's start from, say, 1980. I think I used 1967 in the lectures, but let me use 1980 for this one. So you have your tag. You have your percent change from a year ago, you have your observations, and you have your initial start period. So get the Fred data and wait a little minute. And there we are. Look at that. We have that year-over-year percentage change. So we have 1981 grew from about GDP grew about 2.5% from 1980 to 1981. 1980 contracted about 0.3% from that. So this gives us a nice set of data here. We can see our potential GDP is going out further because it's an estimate of the trend. All right, and we have our information up here along with some nice links to the data if you wanted to go to the actual website. So if I'm interested in an output gap, actually what I would like to graph, and I'll go ahead and for some functionality here, just put my formulas over here. I could go and I could subtract that B8 cell minus that D8 cell, and that, at least for the purposes of my class, is our output gap. We are negative 3.1% off from where we should be. If we go further down and we bring that functionality down, here we have to that last year there, and that can be, say, my output gap. Now, we can do a few things. You can create the graph on your own for from the Excel functionality, if, say, you highlight this data and create the graph. Or what we can also do is we could go ahead and maybe get, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the Fred data tool to create a graph which includes the recession shadings. I'm going to build that, select that GDP C1. That's going to basically build this graph right here. But what I'll do is I'll take this nice graph that we've gotten, get rid of those added grid lines, and what I'm going to do, you see how it's over this real GDP growth? I'm going to take that box and I'm going to move it over to my output gap. So I've taken, again, this really nice graph that Fred has produced for me and manipulated in a way to get what I want here. So this is not real real GDP anymore. This is, say, output gap for Econ 2301, replication 0. And as I've mentioned to some students in former classes, what you want to do is you want to be sure that your graph looks good in any kind of context. If someone, say, has a monitor that doesn't have certain colors, that can be a problem. So you want to try and stay with black and white or grayscale as much as possible so that whenever your client or employer is reading the graph, they can see very clearly what it is on almost any medium here. And this is a nice time series graph showing the dynamics of the output gap over time in the United States. And here we can very clearly see this nice lineup between those negative GDP gaps and recessions. Not so nice over here. This was certainly an interesting year, but there we go. And so we can see then how far off GDP is from its trend and how positive that may be or how negative that may be. So that's our first time series graph with that. I'm going to move him over here because I'm particularly proud of him. He looks pretty good. And I'm going to insert a few other things. Let's say I wanted to talk about the relationship between, say, an output gap and an unemployment gap. And this would be how far unemployment may fall from its trend rate. Let me go and insert one more. So I would use the tag for a UN rate. It's already in percentages, so I'll use a change instead of percentage change. I want an annual rate to compare it to in 1980. And I want my benchmark, or kind of quote-unquote natural rate of unemployment and how that's changing from year to year, also starting in 1980. I'm going to go ahead and get that Fred data now. And if you've taken my class before, you'll recognize that this is the very first replication I have everyone do is they create a scatter plot of what's called Okun's rule. This relationship between GDP and unemployment. In any textbook you'll find, they'll use probably the levels of the growth rates of unemployment, they'll use the growth rate of GDP and maybe the level of unemployment. What I want to do here is I want to use these gaps, this unemployment gap. You can see that this doesn't change all that much here from the NROUST for the natural rate. I have these again in their annual rates. Things look good. But I'm going to create a new column over here for my unemployment gap. And I'll take that difference between the unemployment rate, where we are right now, minus where we should be on that trend. It's not going to be that different from just the straight up unemployment rate, but I like to be consistent with this. So if we're going to create Okun's rule, what we want to do is compare these two. And I'll go ahead and use the Excel functionality for this. And I'll go to Insert. I'll grab a scatter plot graph. And I'll go ahead and graph it. Now note that Excel gives us probably the ugliest graph we can get, so we can only improve from here. First of all, there are too many lines. Let's make this a little bit nicer. The labels of the axes, that's good, but it gets in the way. So you can right-click that axis, go to Labels, move your axis over by using Label Position. Do the same thing here with this Format Axis. And like I said, you want to try and make this not as, I like to do no fill on these because I want the observations to go in the background. And then I'll put in a trend line and a border, maybe a black border is good on that. And we can call this guy Okun's rule replication 0. And I'm going to add in, remember from the previous video, we had these trend lines. And again, trend lines, what I've found lately I've liked to do, so I used to do dashes, but now I've started doing just solid lines. I'll make that a little bit smaller there. And what I can do, if I wanted to make this fade further back into the background, but still sort of catch the eye, is make those a bit gray. But I want to see that relationship between our unemployment gap and our output gap. All right, so then what we have here, the purple box is our horizontal axis, the blue box is our vertical axis. Now what I've got right now is unemployment gap down here, output gap here. I'm not sure I want to do that, so I'm going to go ahead and select this data. I want to switch them out and put the output gap on the vertical. So I'll put my blue box over there, my purple box over here, and there we go. And then I'm going to add axis titles because I want people to know what I've got here. Here's that output gap, and primary horizontal axis, here's that unemployment gap. And now what I can do is demonstrate to my client, to my employee, or to my employer, to my students, that there is a very strong relationship between the output gap and the unemployment gap, which is to say, as we start to get into higher and higher levels of unemployment over the natural or non-accelerating inflation or trend rate, we start to see a deeper contraction of GDP, right? Or of the output gap. So this is a nice demonstration of how we can use this economic data to demonstrate an economic relationship And we can go to, we can talk about, Arthur Okun's general idea here that an increased unemployment, an increased percentage of unemployment, could lead to a decrease of about negative 1.5% in the GDP output now, or the output gap, I should say. If we want to get to GDP, we'd have to do something a little more fancy, but we're good here. And so that then is their first kind of scatter plot graph and how to construct these graphs. And as you move through this course, and as I move through these lectures, you'll notice I'll be using these two tools extensively to demonstrate some of the properties of macroeconomics that we've now studied, going all the way back to Khaldun, Smith, Marx, Keynes, Friedman and Schwartz, Samuelson, that we've been using to make this economic policy that we have. And if you can understand then where all of this is coming from, and Fred moved my data again, so let me move that back so I can get my output gap time series back, so that we can then understand, all right, so if Arthur Okun, who worked in the Kennedy administration, is looking at this and he gets these unemployment figures, then he can make a judgment, because unemployment's monthly data, so that's nice. We can get that before the GDP data comes out. So if he's seeing higher unemployment, he can then go to the Kennedy administration and say, wow, we're probably looking at a contraction in real output. Do we then go towards a fiscal stimulus of increased government spending, decreased taxes, or increased deficits? Do we have the central bank or the Federal Reserve? Do we start suggesting that they lower interest rates? People are going to be looking at these figures and have looked at these figures in order to make their policy. So the purpose of this course and these videos is then to give the justification for the policies that the Federal Reserve and the federal government will be making with an eye towards making sure you know what they are going to do in the case of a global pandemic, in the case of a financial crisis or a mortgage crisis. In a recession, the Keynesian prescription is very set. You increase deficits, decrease taxes, increase spending, or you lower interest rates. And by lower interest rates, what I really mean is you increase the money supply. And that's sort of the central bank outlook on this. But we can then quantify this relationship and see how this works out in the data. And so that's what we'll be doing going forward into lessons 1 through 8, our 8 easy pieces.